You'll soon be cutting less and quilting more. Hello, I'm Deborah Rubles. I live in Lebanon, Missouri. I'm the author of The Quilter's Cutting Guide, The Sliding Ruler Method. I published this book in May of 2017 in Springfield, Missouri. And if you follow the techniques and the instructions in this book, you'll soon be cutting less and quilting more. Today I'm just going to give you a quick cutting snippet about scrap management. I added an extra chapter in the book. Chapter 5 is on scrap management, and that's where we talk about when you have a short piece or a little piece of fabric left after you've cut out a project and you're trying to decide, what am I going to do with this? I usually, if it's less than 15 inches or less than a half a yard, I will usually cut it up into scraps. And the scraps we're going to cut it into today are actually 2.5 inch squares. Now, as all quilters know, you can do many things with 2.5 inch squares. But what I like to do with them is use them as an ender, a leader and an ender, or some people call it a spider, when you actually feed those little pieces of fabric through your sewing machine before you start making that quarter inch stitch. So we're going to cut these into 2.5 inch squares. Now, this piece of fabric that I have is still folded in half like it comes off the boat, and then I have folded in half again. I have pressed it, and whenever you get ready to cut, when I cut my fabric, I have it folded like this. I'm always cutting through 4 layers. And then I always put the fold at my belly. So you need to remember that the fold goes at your belly. And why? Because we're going to use that fold as a straight edge, or it's going to help us square our fabric. So I square all my fabric with 2 rulers, and that's another cutting snippet that you'll have to watch. But today, so I'm going to quickly square up my fabric by placing a ruler on the fold, bring this one over, and then I cut. So there's my square edge. Now, to cut 2.5 inch little squares, I'm going to cut this into 2.5 inch strips, and then I'm going to cut them into squares. So this is where you pull out your book, The Quilter's Cutting Guide, and you open it up, you go to the 2-inch tab, and then you also go to where you find the 2.5 inch strip, 2.5 inch page. So it's got 2.5 inch page here. You'll open it up, you put it at the top of your cutting mat, and I made the numbers big so you can see it. So you can actually see your numbers. Now this fabric is approximately 11 inches wide, and I'm going to cut it in 2.5 inch strips, which means I look at my numbers, the big numbers, and I find something that's close to 11. I'm not going to start at 12.5, but I'm going to start at 10. And what that means is that you find the 10 on your big ruler, and you line up the 10 on the straight edge, or your square edge, cutting it straight edge. These instructions are all explained in my book as far as how to line it up, how to use these charts. But right now I just wanted to give you a demo to show you how to do it. So I've got the 10 lined up on my square edge I just cut. I've also lined up what I call a dark line, either the 1 inch or the second, or the dark line, 1 or the 1st inch or a 2nd inch on that fold at the bottom. So I've got it lined up, and then you cut. So that's my scrap. And then what you do is, that's on 10, you just simply move down the chart. So the next number is 7.5. So you just slide the ruler over, and you place the 7.5 on that straight edge. At the same time, you're watching the bottom fold to make sure the dark line is on that fold. And then you cut. You go to the next number, 5, slide it over to the 5, cut, and the last number is 2.5. So we just cut 4 strips of 2.5 inch. Now we're going to cut these into 2.5 inch squares because it's a scrap, and we want to use them for, as I said, a leader or ender on your sewing machine. So what I'll do is I just carefully pull them aside. Now I'm going to line them up on a line on the cutting mat, like so, because I'm going to cut them all at one time. That's why I like using a 15-inch ruler, You always want to cut with a ruler that's taller than the fabric you're cutting, which means you have wiggle room down here, or you start your rotary cutter on the cutting mat and you end on the cutting mat. Okay, so I've got them lined up here, and then I'm going to square this fabric with the 2 rulers. Chapter 2 in the book is about squaring fabric with 2 rulers. Okay, now this fabric is approximately 10.5. You look at your chart, the big numbers. You find the number that you can go to, which is the 10. So I'm going to line up the 10 on my ruler on that straight edge, like so. I'm also lining up the line down at the bottom, and then you cut. And then you do the same thing as before. You go down the chart, so the next number is 7.5. You simply slide the ruler over. You put that 7.5 on that straight edge, and at the same time you watch to make sure one of the dark lines is on that bottom edge, and then you cut. Now, as you can see, I'm applying pressure, keeping my fingers behind the protective guard and applying pressure, and my squares are not moving. I'm not saying they never move, but most of the time they don't. Okay, then the next number is, going down the chart is 5. Slide it over to 5. And then the last one is 2.5. So we just cut. Oh, one other thing to show you in my book also. This is the number of strips needed, and this is the number of squares you will get out of a number of strips. We just cut 1, 2, 3, 4 strips. So if you look at this, 4 strips, when you cut it into 2.5-inch squares, will give you 64 2.5-inch squares. There's our 64 2.5-inch squares. So that's your cutting snippet today from Deborah Rubles, author of The Quilter's Cutting Guide. You can purchase this book at www.quilterscuttingguide.com. Thank you.